The greatest thinkers in history have all developed 5 elite skills. Skills which have allowed them to escape linear progress with their learning and thinking and experience unforeseen exponential growth. And in this video, I'm going to draw upon my years as an internationally published academic, educator, and entrepreneur to outline exactly what these skills are and how to develop them. But I'm going to go even further than this. As I outline each skill, I'll teach you a mini lesson to help you start learning and practicing them right away. Starting with the first skill, computational reasoning, which includes math, statistics, and logic. Now, it doesn't matter what industry you're in or what you're learning. It probably, at some level, requires some level of proficiency with numbers or logic. And I know what you might be thinking. I'm not a math person, right? But I'm here to call you on your BS. Back when I was in high school, I hated math and I felt so frustrated by it. I felt like I couldn't understand it almost at all. But then a few years into college, I started to get interested in it because I needed to learn it for other stuff I was interested in, such as neurobiology. By the time I got to Columbia University, I was getting all A's in statistics, calculus, and physics. So did I just suddenly become a math person, or did I simply finally find it relevant? But how is it relevant to you? I mean, you might think, well, I'm not doing anything in science or physics, so who cares about computational ability? Well, let me prove to you why you need to hone this skill. Back when I was involved in my first business, which involved training salespeople, I was amazed at how few people could set out a goal and then break down the steps and numbers needed to hit that goal. For instance, in this industry, I needed to assess the following. What is the true conversion rate from an exposure to an appointment booked? What is the true conversion rate from an appointment booked to a sale? What is the average sale amount needed in order to cover costs and generate X amount of profit? And therefore, how many exposures do you need over what period of time? And so in our mini lesson on this skill, we'll discuss how to apply computational reasoning to goal setting and action plans. For those of you who already have tons of computational skill in an academic context, you'll understand more clearly how to apply it to your learning goals. And for those of you who aren't yet strong in this skill, this will help you to understand how these skills are relevant to you and will likely ignite in you a passion to cultivate this skill further. And if you can't do this, I'm sorry to say, but it's unlikely you'll ever hit any of your goals. So let's say your goal is to become a confident public speaker in 3 months. You start with these assumptions. 1. Every 3 practice sessions produces 1 solid talk, a 33% conversion rate. And 2, every 3 talks written leads to 1 live delivery, also a 33% conversion rate. So your overall assumed conversion rate is 9 practice sessions to 1 live talk, or an 11.1% conversion rate. From here, and only from here, can we begin to structure our plan. Because whatever our goal is, we'll have a much better idea of how much activity we'll have to do to hit it. But what if our conversion rate isn't really 11.1%? What if that's just an assumption? How would we even know in the first place? Well, from here, we have to learn how to construct what are called confidence intervals in statistics. And because this is simply a mini lesson, I won't go into all of that here. But to get a better understanding of computational reasoning overall and to further refine these skills, I recommend reading Statistical Reasoning for Everyday Life by Jeffrey Bennett, as well as any Introduction to Logic and Introduction to Calculus book. But understanding computational reasoning is just the first step. We then have to be able to engage in skill number 2, communication and persuasion. Okay, especially if you're an introverted academic type like me, you might be thinking, to be an elite learner, I don't have to be persuasive. I don't even like to talk to anyone in the first place. And I get it, but here's the issue with that. If you can't communicate your ideas clearly and effectively, you probably don't understand them very well in the first place. And that goes for both written and verbal communication. If you've watched other videos of mine, you'll know that one of my core habits every Sunday is to get up in front of the room at my home and simply deliver a lecture to nobody on whatever it is I'm learning. This not only helps me understand what I don't know very well, but it helps me learn how to explain concepts using analogies and also connect what I'm learning to other concepts and fields. I also regularly teach and coach students, so I'm constantly sharpening my skills there too. When I was in sales and then following this running an academic test prep agency, I had to persuade potential clients all the time And over time, I started to realize I was actually learning new ideas, concepts, and real-world human behavioral principles from the people I was persuading and communicating with. And the more you simply put your ideas out there, expose them to critique, and engage in conversation with others, you'll also start to synthesize new ideas. Your old idea plus someone else's idea equals a slightly more nuanced idea. Kind of Hegelian, I know. And so for this mini lesson, I'll teach you this skill in two parts. One, written communication, and two, verbal communication. While structuring a complex argument or creating a compelling narrative takes a lot of practice, the basic building blocks of written communication are strikingly simple. After having written countless essays and also coaching others on essay writing, here's what I've found to be the basic structure. 1, start with a thesis. This is the main idea or point you want to communicate. 2, outline in 2 to 3 sentences how you're going to prove that thesis. 3, use each of these sentences to generate mini theses for each of your body paragraphs. And 4, structure each body paragraph according to this pattern. Claim, followed by an example, or evidence. For verbal communication, it's a bit different, but some of the same principles still apply. In both verbal and written communication, the most powerful ways to persuade people, aside from this structure, is to use 3 components of rhetoric developed by the philosopher Aristotle thousands of years ago. And these are 1, logos, or in other words, actual data or evidence supporting your claim. 2, ethos, or in other words, citing authorities such as organizations, famous people, or experts to support your argument. And 3, pathos, or in other words, the use of emotion to support your argument. Of course, not all communication is or even should be about convincing people. That's an important point. But it's a bit too much to go into here. For a fuller lesson on this, feel free to check out my free masterclass at the link in the pinned comment below. But by now, you might be feeling that the skills we're covering so far are too technical or robotic, and you'd be right. And that's where skill number 3 comes in, literary and artistic interpretation. Okay, I can already hear you saying, but I'm not an artist, I'm more of a scientific or rational thinker. All right, but answer me this. How were some of the greatest discoveries in science made in the first place? Einstein famously cooked up thought experiments to explore physical concepts and was inspired to explore specific lines of inquiry based on dreams he had. And so all of this occurred because of highly creative thinking. One of the most amazing aspects of us humans is our ability to create all sorts of abstractions and constructions. But how do we develop this? Well, while there are many ways of doing so, there's one example of a structured approach to developing this skill I've taught regularly to my students. And one key way of demonstrating this skill is through poetry analysis. Let's take an example of one of my favorite Walt Whitman poems, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. Our first step to interpreting this is to break this down to some more manageable parts. Let's break this up into 2 stanzas. Our next task, especially because poetry can be difficult to understand with all its metaphors and old language, is to try our best to list out the repeated themes next to each stanza. For instance, here we see many words that have something to do with calculation or measurement. And in this following stanza, we see many words having to do with peacefulness or some mystical feeling. Based on our summaries of the themes, we can now summarize our interpretation here, namely that Whitman is juxtaposing 2 ways of perceiving the same phenomenon. One perception being the computational and another being the experiential. And do you see how systematically we were able to analyze this? Okay, but even by this point, you might feel as though you're a little overwhelmed by all the skills you have to learn in order to become a truly top 1% self-guided learner. And that's why we need skill number 4, meta-learning, or more simply, learning how to learn. Now, back when I was in sales, I experienced one of the most powerful and effective approaches to meta-learning I have ever experienced, even having attended an Ivy League school. And that is what we called the ABC method. Now, I've outlined this method in other videos, so I'll only outline it here briefly so you can get the idea of how it works, and also how to use it for yourself. How it works is that you first identify others you want to learn collaboratively with, and you form a small training group or group class. Each week, someone gets up in front of the room to teach a topic, and at the end of their presentation, each person in the room gives feedback in the following way. 1, what this person did well, and 2, what they can improve. This way, it's virtually guaranteed that everyone is learning at the same time. Each person in the room gets a turn to do this for different topics, and each person gets a turn to give feedback. At the end of the session, new assignments are given to each person for the following week, and the process repeats. The beauty of this is that if someone is assigned a topic they aren't familiar with, it forces them to research it, take action on it to have enough experience to share their results with it, and so on. This whole structure essentially forces learning to occur. Now, is it possible for you to perfectly implement this structure into your own life? Maybe not. But what elements of it could you start using to improve your ability to learn? Well, if absolutely none of this works for you, then one of the best books I've found on this topic that has a whole host of techniques you can use for self-guided learning is the book Ultra Learning by Scott Young. But this all still leaves us with a question. What should we learn in the first place? And what information should we prioritize? Well, that brings us to skill number 5. Epistemic hygiene and systems thinking. Nowadays, information access is ubiquitous, but it's also ubiquitously biased, often irrelevant and inaccurate. I don't know about you, but I constantly receive notifications about new research and studies, new content to watch on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, and countless new book recommendations that seem to bury me under their weight. Knowledge is truly endless, but we have to realize that most knowledge isn't actually relevant to our goals or even to our true interests, and that's where systems thinking becomes crucial. Fortunately, I have an entire video to guide you step by step through the process of thinking in systems, so be sure to watch that next here.